I remember extraordinarily well the 2nd of February 1990. I was working for Capital Radio at the time, was relatively new in the station, and we had somebody in Parliament who fed us F.W. de Klerk's speech pretty much as it was unfolding. And there was no embargo on it. Normally it says embargo until finished delivery or whatever. So as we started getting it, we started reporting on it. And so Capital Radio, to the best of my knowledge, was the first radio station to report the gist of what F.W. de Klerk announced. And it was the first news bulletin that I read as a news reader. I'd been with Capital for a while. I'd been a reporter. I'd done live sports and that sort of thing. But it was the first actual news bulletin. My shift started at 11 o'clock. September the 2nd, 1990, I remember reading, F.W. de Klerk has just unbanned the ANC. And not many people listened to Capital Radio 604 in those days, but those who did heard it first. An extraordinary. And one of the things he did on that day was put a moratorium on the death penalty. And the death penalty had been used a lot. I think there were close to 300 people executed in the year leading up to 1990. And between 1960 and 1989, more than 130 people were executed in South Africa for crimes that had a political motive. And journalist and author Peter Auf Der Heyde tells their stories in a just published book, Death in Pretoria. And Peter joins us now via Zoom. Peter, good morning.
Good morning. Hi. Thank you for having me on the show.
When you and I last spoke on the radio, it was a long time ago, but it was about soccer. And every time you and I spoke on the radio all those years ago, it was about soccer. From soccer to telling the stories of political activists executed is quite a leap. What brought you to the story, Peter, or to the stories?
I think the one thing that definitely brought me was my anti-death penalty stance worldwide. I'm very strongly anti-death penalty. And that then just kind of fed into the South African situation a little bit. And I think also the fact that that in a way it gave me a good counterbalance to the mundane actions of football and sport. I think it was that a little bit. And I've always been very interested in and what little contribution I made in the anti-apartheid struggle.
And Peter, the stories, I presume that there was documentary evidence, relative, perhaps reasonably easily attainable, of the names and the sort of broad details of the crimes for which those people were executed. Was that quite easy to find? But then the more difficult thing is bringing those people and their stories to life, humanizing them, taking them from being a death row statistic to a living human being executed for a political view.
Yes and no. In fact, it was very easy to obtain a list of 4,300 something names of people who had been sentenced to death. The problem was the majority of people were sentenced, even those who were sentenced for political reasons, were sentenced ultimately for common crimes like murder or something like that. But they clearly had a political motive. And the difficulty was going through this list of 4,300 names and trying to see those that had a political connotation to them. And that was the difficulty. And the list of 4,300 was also not a list that only had people who were executed, but people who had been sentenced to death.
The ones who would have been executed in the 80s, perhaps easier to find people who remembered them, grew up with them, were political activists with them. Those executed in the 60s, more difficult to
Yes,
excavate their stories.
very much more difficult, because there wasn't as much coverage. There were certainly no campaigns as we had in the 80s when it was Save the Patriots and other campaigns. There was kind of campaigns to stop people from being executed. You had, I'm sure people can remember the Uppington people. So there were lots of people who had been, where whole groups had been sentenced to death, but that wasn't in the 60s. And that was the difficulty of uncovering these stories and finding people to speak to about them.
And Peter, my view reading a book like yours is thank you for writing it, because it reminds me of stuff that I once knew and had forgotten. It tells me more about stuff that I had a very superficial understanding and knowledge of, and it tells me about people of whose existence and of whose role in the anti-apartheid struggle I was unaware. And I think the more that we engage with our history, the better chance we have of making sense of our present and our future. But there are going to be people who are going to take issue with any kind of excavation of the past. What's the point? Why keep bringing up the past? That doesn't help us. What's your aim in having this book out there?
I think my aim is very much, as you've just said, telling stories that people just don't know about. If I was to go, and I did this a lot, I just asked people, can you name me anybody who was sentenced to death and executed in South Africa? And people would generally say Solomon Mahlangu. Some people would maybe say John Harris. Maybe a few people would say Vuyisile Mini, but that's where it stopped generally. The other 130 something were just simply forgotten. And I think that went through the whole process of writing the book, is how people actually just simply didn't care about these individuals. Probably, and one of the most dramatic things that I found out, for instance, is that a person who had been sentenced to death had received leave to appeal. So he had an appeal that he could that should be heard. And the clerk of the court simply forgot to write his name down, and the person was executed without his appeal being heard. And those kind of things, obviously, so those are the kind of stories that people have to hear about.
And I'm very, very glad that you are offering the opportunity for those who want to read to be able to do so. Peter Auf Der Heyde, thanks for joining us this morning, author of the just published Death in Pretoria.